Zoom. Let's see here. Okay, that's just checking out the chat. Okay, well, good morning and welcome. I did not put the title of this on my agenda, but I will introduce Dr. Shelly Brown-Jeffy, and then she will take us away with the introduction of the panel, and I will be asking questions of her and kind of moderating the conversation. So Dr. Brown-Jeffy, if you would please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the panel this morning. Oh, you're muted.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shelly Brown-Jeffy. I muted myself because, as we all are somewhere probably in our homes with lots of movement in the background, especially if you have children or significant others or wonderful fur babies running through your house right now, I would like to welcome everyone to this panel. And the title of the panel is Raising Black Children in Our White Spaces During the Black Lives Movement. And I have to give thanks where thanks is due to April for coming up with that wonderful title for this panel. April is a sister, friend, scholar, as well as Ayesha. And I'm going to do first names because that's my love for you, but you may know them as Dr. Boyce or Dr. Ruffin Adams. We have been in this journey together at UNCG as Black women in leadership and as parents for multiple years now. And we've shared a lot of our conversations through this space. And I want to begin by saying that I'm not big on introductions. Titles exist in different worlds. And as Ayesha and April know, titles vary who you're talking to. And the only time I'm doctor is when I'm at UNCG. So the rest of that, I'm someone's mom, wife, person, hey you, it is what it is. But I want to begin our conversation and I just want to say that this panel was born out of a conversation that I had with April many years ago. And we were talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates' letter to his son about being Black in America in the book In Between the World and Me. And at the time, our children were young. I mean, they were really young. And more importantly, our boys were young. I mean, maybe waist high at the time. I'm not even sure how young they were, but they really seemed small and innocent. And they were children, not yet teenagers. And because they were so small, we felt we could protect them from the world. In fact, we had not yet thought about how the world, particularly structural racism, could take that away from us. And even though April's children were much younger than my children, she wanted to know what I had done about the talk as a mom. And we talked about how maybe we should write a letter to our sons, but not just to our sons, to our children, because we both have a son and a daughter. And that conversation was a real eye opener for me. And it was the wake up call that I needed to have the talk with my children. And yet I did not know where to begin. But as always the case, life jumps in and the conversation begins. So in a little bit, I'm going to let April do her introductions for how she wants to be known. Students call me Dr. Shelly. My colleagues call me Shelly. The kids that run through my life call me Miss Shelly or Miss Jeffy or PJ's mom or Rochelle's mom. And in my husband's family, I'm known as Richelieu's wife. So we all have multiple identities that we talk about. And so I'll let April choose the ones that she wants to share with you when she introduces herself. And now I begin. Over the years, I watched the countless tragedies of young Black boys, young Black bodies that were killed at the hands of the police. I had to think, my children will never be in this situation. We do not live in a city, we live in suburbia, a golf course community. We rarely saw the police except for when there was a medical emergency. I had to rationalize that my children would be safe because that was the only way that I could function, to be able to sleep at night. Yes, I know I was kidding myself, but that's what I did. My husband and I have achieved the middle class dream. Individually, maybe not so much middle class, but together we're a dynamic duo. Neither one of us grew up middle class, and now we were comfortably middle class, as I often tell my children, raising middle class children. As middle class parents, we were able to give our children what they wanted, what they needed, and many material items that they really just did not need. We moved into a middle class neighborhood where we were the diversity. The neighborhood was not very diverse when we first moved in, although it became a little more so as new families have moved in. But there were very few children on our block. A few of my children's friends lived close by, and we were giving our kids a middle class life, but we were also giving them a very white life, a life where they were in the racial minority. My children attended the newly built elementary school that was about 9% African American, 9% Asian, and about 6% Latinx. The middle school was slightly more diverse, but the high school was significantly less diverse, with fewer non-white students and very few Black students. Needless to say, my children's friendship networks were mostly white. They played recreation and travel soccer, and as a friend of mine once told me, my kids play the sport that all middle class kids play. They excelled at the sport, and they were often the only Black players on the team. It was easy for other parents to pick out our children on the soccer field. My husband and I would even joke about how our kids were sometimes the only Black kids at their own birthday parties. But did it really matter what neighborhood we were in? My kids were growing up in a post-racial America. They were growing up with a Black president. Barack Obama was elected president when my children were 3 and 7. They were growing up with a Black hero. They were growing up in a world where a Black person, a Black man, someone with darker skin could become president of the United States twice. But soon, I realized I could no longer ignore the destruction of Black bodies. When Trayvon Martin was killed, murdered, my son was 9 and my daughter was just becoming a teenager. Trayvon Martin was in a middle-class neighborhood, just like the one my kids live in. My daughter was not driving yet, and my son did not walk through the neighborhood at night. In my mind, they were still young. I felt I had time, or so I thought. Then it happened. Just a year after Trayvon Martin was murdered, Keith Lamont Scott was shot in Charlotte, North Carolina. Keith had been sitting in his car. His neighbors said that he often was sitting in his car waiting for his son to get off the school bus. The police story is that Keith Scott had a gun. His wife, who witnessed and recorded the event, said he did not. The video released by his wife and later by the police department did not show a gun in his hand when he was shot. I remember watching TV at dinner with the family, something that we always do. Most nights we watch game shows, we often watch Family Feud, but tonight we were watching the protests. Our children asked, "What's going on?" And we explained to them that another Black man was shot by police. We explained that some believe he was shot simply because he was Black and that the police treat Black people differently. We explained that the police said the guy had a gun, but there were reports that he didn't. My husband and I thought about driving to the protest, but we were both worried about the safety of our family. The same system of structural racism that led to the protest was the same system of structural racism that we would face at that protest. We decided that we were not ready. After all, the subject of police brutality and systemic racism was a new conversation for our family. So the moment was here. We were finally having the talk with our children, or should I say, we started the first of many talks. We then had our conversation about systemic racism and what it meant to be Black in America, and how as a Black person, you need to take that certain precaution when dealing with others, particularly the police, to stay safe. As we talked about what was going on, I saw something I had never seen in my kids' eyes before. I saw a bit of hope disappear. That hope that had been shining brightly in their eyes when Barack Obama was elected as president was slowly seeping away, the way rain washes the chalk off a driveway. It was as if I could see that hope disappear. A bit of the joy of being an innocent kid rolled out of their eyes when I said, because he was Black. As a mom, my heart broke. You see, we never really talked about race like this with our kids. Even though I teach about it all the time, I never talked about these systematic structures that move against Black bodies. Maybe I just wanted to keep their innocence. Maybe I didn't want to make them hyper vigilant about their skin tones, about race while dealing with their large collection of non-Black friends, their white friends. Maybe it's because I did not want them to know that the beautiful color of their skin was seen as a deficit to many whose skin was the same color as their closest friends. Maybe I was scared, scared of the truth and scared of what knowing the truth would do to them. That night, we continued the talk. Our daughter would be driving soon, and she needed to know how to deal with law enforcement if she was ever involved in a traffic stop. Our son would soon be a teen and look like Trayvon Martin as he walked through our neighborhood. It was a somber night as a parent, as a mom. I hated having this talk, to see the innocence drawn from my kids. But then I thought, we're middle class. We're late to the game. Maybe if we lived in a different space, we would have had to have this talk before now. Maybe being middle class, we had protected them from social ills. Maybe, maybe not. Even though we never talked much about systemic racism with our kids, we as parents, and my husband and I, did what I call our parent check before we let our Black children float in the lives of their white-skinned friends' world. When they would leave on outings with other parents, the white parents, we would remind our kids within earshot of the parents that we did not want the police calling us because our kids misbehave. These remarks were often met with the statement of, don't worry, I'll make sure they don't cause any trouble, or I'll keep an eye out. It was our passive aggressive subliminal message of having to remind these parents to be vigilant of potential police encounters with the police. And it was our way of doing that without making it a hyper-vigilant race-based conversation. However, as the kids grew older and bigger and older and bigger, these messages needed to be less subliminal and more straightforward, especially as our children began to venture out without these adults. As our kids began to venture into the world solo, without adult protection, and with a group of friends that did not look like them, I realized that they needed not only to take precautions, but they needed to be even more aware. And this is when I realized that the talk needed to move just beyond my kids, but to include their network, our network. And I realized this in a very scary way. As, as my children became older, they started wandering through the neighborhoods by themselves. My daughter and her friends tended to walk through the park, but my son and his friends would go many places around the neighborhood. And over the summer, the boys would go fishing. Yep, there's a lake at the park at the end of my street, and there are several lakes on the golf course. And apparently the lakes on the golf course have the better fish. As I was recently told by the boys, catfish and bass. And they're pretty big. One evening after fishing a few years ago, the boys were sitting in the car talking about fishing. They were on their way to some other activity, and they had just stopped by the house to pick up money and grab a change of clothes. When my children talk, I often listen. You hear good stuff that way. And that's when I heard it, the statement to my son, you could have ghosted the police. What? Say what? My heart stopped. What? Say that again? My child had a run-in with the police? Not exactly. You see, the kids are on the golf course ponds, fishing, catch and release, and then they were told to get off the golf course. The person said, "If I see you again, I will call the police." The boy said my son could ghost the police because he could run faster than the police. And maybe he could, but running from the police is not an option for an African American child. And it's then that I started the other side of the talk. Even though I would think my child would know better, I had to be sure that even if they all started running, he needed to know that he was the easy target. And if he were the one shot, there would less likely be legal trouble because his cell phone or the fishing pole or even his hand could look like a gun, a weapon to a police officer who could say that he was scared by my son's Black body, a defense that many police officers have used to justify legally by law shooting someone with dark skin because they were scared of them and feared for their lives. I never asked my son if he would run or not. I think I was scared of the answer, and I hope and pray that he remembered that he could not run. But now I realize that I needed his network, those with whom he spent time with, to know that my son could not run from the police, and they needed to know why. Not only did my son need to know that the world viewed dark skin differently, but his friends needed to know how the world viewed their friend with dark skin. I sat with the boys and I told them that police shoot dark, brown skinned boys in the back as they run away because they see them as a threat. I took this time too to remind my son that the world sees him differently than his friends, and that must be considered not just by him, but by everyone that he spends time with. As I called the boys individually by their names, I told them one by one how the police officers might see them. I told the one that tans pretty nicely in the summer that he needed to be careful as well because folks might think that maybe he was Native American or Hispanic, and as a brown body, he could be shot in the back as well. The other kids whose skin burned in December, I told him he was probably safe because no matter what angle the police were looking at him, they could clearly see that he was white. But I wanted to relate to the kids that the police see people differently. And if you are perceived to have black skin, brown skin, dark skin, to be black or look like my son, you cannot run from the police. And if you are with my son, you cannot run from the police. The boys needed to know that when the police see my son, at the time, a middle schooler, not much, actually shorter than me, that the police did not see his personality. They did not see a kid who really didn't like fishing, but he wanted to hang out with his friends. All they saw was a threat, a criminal. They needed to know that if the police saw them running, they would assume they did something wrong and that my son's dark-skinned body did something wrong. My son's dark-skinned body would be the target, and my son's dark-skinned body is the body that would need to be stopped. I told them that my son cannot run from the police. It was dangerous and it could be deadly for him. And I warned them that they should not run either, if for no other reason than to keep their friends safe. And as I was going through this incident, it reminded me of a walk that my husband and I had one time on the golf course. And we were walking along the perimeter of the golf course on an evening stroll, and someone came out of their house and said, "Hey, I just want to let you know that you're on a golf course and you're not supposed to be here." You can take that statement any way you want it. I know how my husband and I took it. And it says something about our neighborhood. So I want to also say that there was another mom in the car, a white mom, at the start of the conversation. I could see that she was a little bit shaken by this conversation. She probably never thought of the possibility of her son being shot in the back as he ran away from the police because she had not recited the names of the boys that it happened to. She did not have to because they did not look like her son. She had probably never had that talk with her children. She didn't have to. But now I had started the talk with her and her children because they needed to know. And after this incident with my son, I started giving this talk with my daughter's friends and their moms, just in casual conversation. Because you see, the talk about systemic racism and how Black and Brown bodies are abused and ended within the system of racial inequality should not just happen in African American households. While my children need to know about the concept of race and how little Black and Brown children are viewed by the police and the world and society, my children's friendship networks need to know that this information as well, mostly because their parents don't have to have the same conversation with them. Maybe we need to have more time to talk about this. Maybe this would lead to fewer marches. Maybe we have more talks within our diverse networks with our friends. Maybe if they understood better, maybe if they understood how the police see us, Black bodies, brown bodies, then maybe things will change for the better. In African American houses, the talk is a conversation parents have with their children about how to engage with mainstream white American authority figures, particularly the police. The talk is designed as a way for African American parents to keep their children safe as they ventured out into the world. However, having the talk with just your own African American children is not enough to keep them safe as they venture out into the world. In today's multicultural society, it's not only important for African American children to understand how to be safe in society, their friends, especially those who do not look like them, also need to understand the rules of engagement for Black and Brown bodies. The other side of the talk is one that needs to happen when your children and their friends and their parents are included. And I'm going to turn it over to April to introduce herself in the terms that she wants to use for her identity for this panel and continue the conversation.
Well, hello. Thank you so much, Shelly, for having me and giving us a platform to have this conversation. And of course, Dr. Boyce, thank you for being my fellow sister working it today. We are doing our thing today on Zoom. I am April Ruffin Adams, Dr. R.A. to my students. But today I want to talk to you as a mother. I want to talk to you about my children, and I want to let you know that my children are truly my children. They have been trying to reconcile race and racism in this country, past and present, for most of their lives. You see, from the beginning of their little bitty lives, they've been the children of an African American studies professor and an attorney who is involved in social justice issues. They are also children who live and are educated in a predominantly white environment. Their experiences are different from mine in several ways. I was raised by a father who was a diversity and inclusion executive before that's what it was called. And my mother was a high school history teacher who is a radical and extreme social justice advocate. I also had a strong Afrocentric community upbringing. I attended an all-Black preschool, lived in an all-Black neighborhood, and had friends that my parents went to college with and grew up with. My children's experiences are completely different because they are able to attend a private school in our area where there are many wealthy white children. They live in a bubble away from many of the social issues of the day. And yet, these issues permeate every area of all of our lives. As parents, my husband and I have to wrestle with our decision to provide them with an education that we feel addresses their educational needs, yet we know this education does not provide for many of their social and cultural needs. As a result, my son and daughter have several questions about the recent racial tensions in our world. So today I want to speak to you about raising Black children in predominantly white spaces during a pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. It seems to me that prior to George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, that white people in the United States felt that Black people were exaggerating claims of racial discrimination that have always been commonplace for us. And yet we are both constantly, my husband and I, concerned about raising our kids, these two beautiful Black children, in a world that has given certain members of the society a right to kill them in plain sight without recourse. You see, if my son or daughter are pulled over, there is no assurance that the police or other citizens watching would view them as citizens to be protected. So George Floyd pleaded with the officers, stating, "I can't breathe." Lorraine Hansberry spoke eloquently about Black people needing to breathe in 1962, stating, "In the 20th century, men everywhere like to breathe, and the Negro citizen still cannot, you see, breathe. And thus far, the intensity of our resentment has not yet permeated white society, which remains, in spite of the headlines, convinced it is our problem." She wrote that in 1962. Many times people have an issue speaking about privilege, and particularly white privilege. This is an issue particularly sensitive in my children's school, because educators are uncomfortable addressing both their own privilege and racism, as well as racism and political power of the parents at the school. Privilege, white privilege, of course, is the ability to not have to think about race or concern yourself with it, because this world is not set up against you, it is set up for you. So I have a story to tell about my son's junior K teacher. As I said, my kids go to a country club school, and they had the most loving and really progressive junior K teacher. And because of my awareness of racial issues, and this was our first year at the school, I spoke to her every day. I was in the school every day after school to speak with this teacher, because I was uneasy about the situation. And so I spoke to her one day, and she was telling me about my son, who was not necessarily on his best behavior. And I told her that we have had this conversation, my husband and I, with my son, who is 4 at that time, and said, "Listen, you do not have the ability to misbehave or behave in the way that your classmates do." And she said, "Oh, why? He most certainly can. He has every right, every privilege that every child in here has." And I said, "No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. They are killing Black boys." And she grabbed her necklace and said, "Oh my God, I never thought about that." So race and privilege are at the heart of this discussion for me as a mother. Juanima Lubiano, a professor at Duke, wrote about race in the book entitled "The House That Race Built." And she said, the United States is not just the domicile of a historically specific form of racial oppression, but it sustains itself as a structure through that oppression. If race and its strategic social and ideological deployment as racism didn't exist, the United States' severe inequalities and betrayals of its formal commitments to social equality and social justice would be readily apparent to anyone existing on this ground. She went on to explain that central to the existence of racism is the politics of its denial. It is in the best interest of the right to assert the non-existence of racism, except as a manifestation of individual pathology, a matter simply of individuals with bad attitudes. But it is the shame of liberals who think of themselves as a guardian, as a witness to correct concern and consciousness, that they have elected to treat racism as a problem of individual social relations and not the systematic operation of power at work throughout our political economy. So here's another instance from my life. I spoke recently with the secretary at my kids' school, and she talked about how she felt so comforted by the police officers being present at her church. And she said it just made her feel so comfortable. Now, I didn't remark, but in my mind, I'm thinking, I cannot even think about Jesus when I see police officers walking through the church. It's not a comforting thought to me at all. Of course, this is because of the historical differences between Black people and white people engaging with the police. Indeed, this is a source of confusion for my child also, who is dealing with, again, in this very elite private school, the meaning of the history of the United States that he's learning about and struggling with the tensions to make sense of the social environment that he is increasingly aware of in 2020 and 2021. In school, my son is taught that the police are going to protect him. However, he has seen in the news that police are killing people who look like him. This is a struggle for Black parents and Black children that I suspect white children do not have to deal with. My son is also trying to make sense of American history. He's been learning about presidents and Alexander Hamilton, and he's come home and asked me what presidents owned slaves, and he's trying to make sense of it all. Mommy, can you own slaves, or could you own slaves and still be a good person? And of course, my answer to him was no, with no uncertain terms, no. My son is trying to make sense of these men that he's been taught about in class as heroes who could own people like him and people who mistreated folk like him. My son and daughter are living in a world where they are confronted constantly with different meanings for Black and white families. I want to end my conversation today with probably the easiest thing that I could possibly do. My husband wrote an article in June regarding the burden of Black parenthood. And I want to share a part of it. And he said in his thing, he looks and he says, his son's too curious. Who's that? My son asked. Tamir Rice, he said, staring straight ahead. Do you know him? He asked. I didn't know him personally, but people are posting his picture because today would have been his 18th birthday. Well, what happened? My son said. I continued looking at him, looking away from him, fully realizing the direction this conversation was heading. He was killed by a police officer. He was 12 years old, I said. 12, my son asked. His voice was raising. Did the officer get arrested? No. Why not? He asked, his voice now full of disappointment and disbelief. There was no simple response. Sometimes the burden associated with parenting Black children, especially Black boys, demands dialogue that I wish I could indefinitely postpone and conversations that I should not be forced to have. I would rather discuss classmates, crushes, video games, and how it feels to be a fifth grader. Instead, my husband and I must explain why Tamir Rice never celebrated his 12th birthday. We must tell our son why the officer who shot him was never arrested, another sobering, unjust, and often repetitious outcome that has become commonplace when Black people have been killed during interactions with the police. My son at that point was 10 years old. He's now 11. So just 2 years shy of Tamir Rice's age when his life was stolen forever. And soon my son will join the ranks of licensed drivers and large students, large Black boys who have gone from now being oohed and awed at in their current spaces to being a danger. So as Black parents, we're often forced to wear masks of feigned courage, armed with a frightening reality that even the most routine traffic stop can forever change the dynamic of a family. Traumatizing my son is never my goal, but preparing him for a world that has repeatedly rejected Black boys would be the ultimate act of negligence, not preparing him. Not everyone values him, cherishes him, and loves him the way we do. Today, he is cute and harmless and still short of the threshold of being labeled as menacing and threatening. Yet one day, without proper warning and prior notice, he will unceremoniously be stripped of his innocence and forced to lean solely on the lessons and counsel that we have previously provided him. What terrifies us most is not being there to protect him when that moment occurs. So many Black parents share this fear, and the past year and years have brought this into focus for many of us. So my son and many other Black children, the instruction begins now. And even as Shelly said, it should begin for their white counterparts as well. And although it is not an enviable task, it is a task that must be fulfilled because this is America. And sadly enough, this is the burden we share as Black parents. Thank you.
Shelly and April, thank you so much for your reflections. As you were both talking, everything completely resonates with me. My son is very young, 2.5 years old. So that is coming, but lots of other talks kind of before then. It's interesting that you both talk about the lives that you are giving your children. And in many ways, I think about my own upbringing. So neither of my parents grew up in middle class, but my dad, who is a doctor, my mom, who is a teacher, strive to give us the very lives that you have given to your children. And so having gone to all white private schools, being, in grade school and middle school and high school, some of the only Black children in these white spaces, it really resonates with me, the conversations that you have with your children and the conversations that my parents had with me. A moment that really sticks out for me in my own life was my brother went to a Catholic all boys high school, and I went to the accompanying Catholic all girls high school. And he, up until his sophomore year, had this like long, just beautiful hair, and he used to get it cornrowed. And I remember coming home one day and my dad made him cut it because of, it's that space. And so, wow, so silly. But I think, these are the experiences. And I think having to make decisions about our children, so right now I live in a pretty much all Black neighborhood. And that's a decision that my husband and I have made because of all these experiences that I've had. But as my son gets closer to the age to be in kindergarten, we continuously have these conversations about, are we going to move? Are we going to send them to private school? What are we going to do? And I just think it's, these are the conversations that no one tells you you're going to have as a Black parent until you become a Black parent. So thank you so much for sharing that. So I have a couple of follow-up questions. I'm trying to get to a space where it's okay to have emotions. So I'm not going to apologize for the emotions that I'm having. But I will say thank you so much for sharing your stories, because I also think about, in my household growing up, we had lots of conversations, but my parents never engaged my friends in having those conversations. And, so just kind of thinking about the importance of that. And so I'm hoping, sorry, I'm hoping that maybe you both can speak to, and then we'll go to some questions in the chat. I'm hoping that you can speak to, how did you decide? It sounds to me like you had the chat because it was kind of thrust upon you, like all of these events kind of happened that you needed to have these conversations. And I'm just wondering, maybe other parents out there wondering, what's the youngest that you think that you should kind of begin these conversations? It sounded to me like your children were maybe between 9 and 11 when you had these conversations. And so just wondering, what are some of your thoughts about when to start having these conversations and how to go about engaging with teachers, how to go about engaging with your friends, your children's friends' parents.
I'm going to call you Ayesha now. We broke the doctor. Okay. I'm calling you Ayesha now. So one of the things Shelly said in the beginning, this, for both of us, it wasn't like an organic, we were probably at the Old Town Draft House, maybe having a conversation, like, and just talking about how do we even, begin this? And I was asking her, as the mother of children who were older than mine at that time, like, how do you do this? Because she was, like, this is mentoring, how do you exist in this world? Because we're providing this life for our kids, and we have to make certain compromises. We're making these compromises, but we can't remove ourselves from the responsibility that we have as parents to address this. Because if we don't address it, and in some ways have some kind of in the back of our minds, we know we have to do it, but if we don't have some kind of internal prep for us prior to, we could all be caught off guard, right? And I thought, there may have been something on the news, but I talked to Shelly and I was like, this is just concerning. And we are Black women researchers, and Patricia Hill Collins always told me that it's our experiences that we have to create that knowledge that isn't out there, and we have to be the ones who tell our story. And so Katie Cannon just recently told me that, tell it. If everybody says your truth is a lie, tell it anyway. That's what she said, tell it anyway. And so I knew that this was something that we needed to, as two Black mothers, and to people, members of academia, which I always hesitate, but to members of the academy, we needed to speak about the importance of it. Even if we were terrified and scared and all of the emotions, we needed to do it for the safety of our kids and for the safety of other kids. I'll let you go, Shelly.
I'll say that the conversation needs to evolve around the lives of your children. So from early on, I've always started telling my children that they had beautiful brown skin and beautiful dark skin. And whenever my kids would say, Mom, what's your favorite color? I would always say, it's brown. It's the color of your skin. It's also my last name, but I would just say, beautiful brown skin. And I would try to put that message into them, because not only is brown skin not deemed beautiful unless it's exoticized, and that happens within community and outside of our community. So it's a double whammy for my children. And both of my kids are beautifully brown because they have a beautifully brown daddy. And, we talk about this all the time. When your kids ask the questions, answer in child appropriate ways. I tried not to sugarcoat, but I tried not to scare. When I talk about the things that could happen, the problem is that our kids are always wired in and they see everything. And I give my students reading assignments. So my kids were very big on, it won't happen to me. I was like, okay, but here are the situations where it happens. And here, if it happens, this is what's going on. I'm teaching my kids lessons that my husband and I never had to engage with. And I'm reminding my husband that my husband grew up, he went to a private boarding school where he was one of the 5 Black kids there that were all on the basketball team, which we make jokes about all the time. But he also grew up in a situation where even though he stood out, there was no George Floyd, there was no Tamir Rice, there was no Black Lives Movement. And while maybe these incidents had happened, and we know that happened, they hadn't happened with as much frequency, and there wasn't data and factual information that's going on. So I think my aha moment was engaging with the news. And so engage with the news, engage with the stories, engage with what happened. Start with maybe something innocent. To this day, if I'm about to walk out of Target or any store and the buzzer goes off that something has a scanner on it, I stop and do not walk through. And droves of people walk by me and go, what? And I catch the eye of the security officer or whoever's looking at me at the opening before I walk through, so that they will know that the buzzer is not me. And my kids are like, why did we stop? I said, because honey, There are people that think Black people steal. And if we walk through while the buzzer's going on, going to think we took something. But mommy, we didn't take anything. I know. And this is what I'm doing to avoid having to have that conversation. Sometimes I put it in context of to avoid being embarrassed, to avoid delaying getting ice cream or wherever we're going to not have to deal with that situation. And that was child appropriate for my kids to understand. I've sat both of my kids down with their friends. We've turned on the news. My daughter participated in several of the Black Lives Matters rallies over the summer, and she was there for Say Her Name. And as she and her friend were leaving, I looked at her friend with blonde hair and peach skin, as we talk about in our household. I said, you understand that Rochelle has to be back by curfew. And she said, yeah, no, we're supposed to be back by curfew. I said, no, you don't understand. Let me be clear. She has to be in the house before curfew because the police aren't as nice to her. And that's why you're going to the march. And then it made sense because the march was about the police treating Black bodies differently. And while I'm not sure that my children's friends see them as Black bodies in the context of what's happening in the news, I make that perfectly clear that yes, this is your friend and you don't see the color of their skin. The society that you're in sees the color of their skin, and here's what that visual creates. And there is so much out there to show this to your children, to show this to your children's friends, and to have this conversation with their parents as well. And yes, I think we can create the opportunities and the space for these conversations. One, we should create conversations about parenting in our academic spaces. When someone has a child on campus, it should never feel like the first time someone has had a child on campus, because these campuses have been here for hundreds of years. And if you have the history for women's campus, oh my gosh, someone has had a baby. So when we start to normalize these conversations, they become the regular conversations and not the difficult ones to have, but the standard ones to have.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for your answers. I completely agree with both of you. I think people are uncomfortable talking about race and gender identity and sexuality because no one talks about race or gender identity or sexuality. And so I think that's really important. I'm just going to go to our questions just for a moment here. So Pat Leviton has been really active in the chat. Thank you so much, Pat. They say, I think we always have had the George Floyds, but with social media and cell phone videos, we all know in real time what is happening. And I completely agree with that. Lolita Watkins asked you a question. She says, how do we help whites understand the different roles African-American parents have in raising our children?
I think that's one of the things, I guess the pandemic is probably teaching all of us to be patient and gentle with ourselves. And where there was a time where I would probably be full of attitude and upset about needing to explain that, I'm now more patient and loving in my answers because I want to be heard. But I think it's an important thing for us to explain so that we can be heard, and it's not always in a sensitive way, but explain so that you can be heard, that your experience, no matter if you do have a PhD and your husband has a JD, right? No matter if your kids are in this environment with your kids, that our experiences still in this world are different. And the reasoning behind that is much bigger than any of us can ever really just explain in a moment, right? And we are living with something that at this point is almost it is without blame, right? So let's make everybody feel comfortable. So with it, we're all functioning in this system. But I think we have to explain that my experience is this just popped in my head. I always tell my students this. Chris Rock did a joke one time. I know this sounds like I'm going off, right? Chris Rock did a joke one time, and he talked about his neighborhood. And he said that in his neighborhood, he lived in the same neighborhood with Mary J. Blige, Jay-Z, and him. And he said, you know who my next door neighbor is? A dentist. So the world for us is different, no matter where we are. We are not on the same. It's worlds apart. It's worlds apart. Even as we, of course, our Lord comes in, this outsiders within, that we're struggling with this. And I think that's where we are. So we have to explain to them that our lives, though they may seem on some level similar, our experiences and the systems that are working on us and we're working within are very different. I apologize, that was rambling, but that's a difficult thing to speak of.
As many of you know me, I'm a storyteller. I think stories resonate with people, especially within and outside of academic spaces. Tell the stories. Tell the stories of your childhood. Tell the stories of growing up. Tell the stories of your kids. Tell the stories that are different. Talking about parenting, the differences in parenting, we've started the hair conversation. And it's moved on from the hair conversation. My daughter played sports, and before the natural movement, we used to sit down with the hot comb, and you may remember that, and you don't sweat your hair out. And she's on the soccer field and it's raining, and I'm looking at all of these other folks, and I'm looking at my daughter's hair go from shoulder length to a teeny weeny afro. And parents were amazed, like, oh my gosh, your hair does that. Yeah, black hair is different. I remember she had braids, and all of the blonde girls wanted braids. And they're like, oh, her hair won't stay together. Yeah, it's different. But you put a rubber band on the end and it works. And then moving from those conversations to point out that the differences, these are the differences, not just in how we look, but how the world sees us. I once used to say, and this is funny, on the soccer field, folks would come up and say, which child is yours? And I'd look at them and say, I'll give you three choices. I said, three options, and the first two don't matter. And they'd look at the field and go, oh, oh. And that's the start of the conversation. Oh, we're visible. We're different. You can find my son walking to the field in any event. You could find my daughter walking to the field in any event, because we're different and we stand out. And then what does this difference make? And I will also say on another note that my family comes to visit over the summer, and we're like 26 deep in the house. And we'll invite a couple of these soccer families. And before they come, we'll say, I just want you to know that my family's Black. And I leave the statement like that. And they look confused for a moment, like, why did you say that? And I said, think about it. I want you to know that you are walking into an all Black environment. And while it's fun and it's friendly, I want them to be aware of the dynamic and the switch. And so maybe that gives them an eye into, hey, looking different. I think that one of the ways to bring white parents into this conversation is through our children's friendship networks and through these conversations. And it's more than just, my son is allergic to peanuts, or they can't have shellfish, or I don't like them watching this on television, or they need to go to bed, to say, hey, while you're out in public, can you keep an eye on my child? Not so that he doesn't misbehave, but so that his misbehavior doesn't create a police interaction without someone to advocate for them.
Thank you for that. As we wrap up, I'll just read one other comment from Pat Leviton. It used to be just Black boys, but the talk is now with Black girls as well, younger and younger. 2021 horrific. And a note for Noelle. By the way, can CACE get Ayesha Garza as a keynote speaker next year? She's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, and her book, The Power of Purpose, is excellent. You already answered Risa Applegarth's question, but I'm just going to read it so that you can see it and hear it. Thank you all to the members of this panel for sharing such compelling narratives. If you are willing to share more about strategies you've used in conversations with white teachers or others in these white spaces, I'd love to hear more about these strategies. Ways to normalize the conversations we need will be great. So as we kind of wrap up, thank you so much, Shelly and April, for your thoughtfulness and the depth for which we've gone in such a short period of time. Others have said that they would like to connect. There's their information. Others have said that they would like more opportunities to continue to have these sorts of conversations. So, this would be, I think, a great conversation with the community to, kind of continue this conversation and allow spaces for Black and white and brown and every other parent to come and interact with these really important topics. So thank you so much to both of you for your time and on this important topic. And I enjoyed being able to moderate, and I think we'll move on to our next Zoom event. Everyone take care.